Thank you both for joining us today. It's pretty remarkable to see that sizzle reel, which was clearly edited before we knew how insane the numbers were going to be this weekend. $350 million in the US, which people thought was impossible for a 3-hour-long movie, just logistically impossible based on the number of theaters to sell that many tickets, and $1.2 billion globally, an unheard of number. I think to put that in context, to put that Avengers Endgame number in context, the next biggest movie was your last movie, Avengers Infinity War. That opening weekend gross was $640 million. So it's just amazing what you've been able to do here with this Avengers franchise and with a movie that has really become an event for the whole world in a way that we've never seen this before. So first, are you surprised by how well it did this weekend?
I mean, yeah, we were definitely surprised. I mean, we knew the movie was good. We knew that there was a massive amount of anticipation for it, but you can never sort of predict something like this. I will say, I do think this kind of runaway success, the phrase like standing on the shoulders of giants always comes to my mind because the MCU has been building for so long. Audiences have such a depth of emotional investment in these characters and in these narratives that when it is finally coming to a climax, it was, something pretty remarkable happens.
And so what's your reaction, Joe? Were you at home this weekend watching the numbers come in and thinking this is impossible, or we always knew it was going to get to be a cultural touch point?
No, obviously we had, again, there's no way to predict this as unprecedented levels of box office, and there's no metric for it. So, we saw numbers coming in, I think, on Tuesday from some international markets, from some of the Asian markets, and we were on a record-setting pace there, so we had a good feeling that we had good momentum. Again, it's just sort of shock and awe. But I do think it's a testament to serialized storytelling, something that really can only be made possible through social media and collective global conversations about content. And this movie really has really benefited from that.
So speaking of social media, I'm going to interrupt you for a second and say, please feel free to tweet. Disney has put restrictions on sharing any of the video content, but you can feel free to share the pearls of wisdom from Joe and Anthony up here. So tweet away, and we will be opening up to audience Q&A towards the end. I have committed to no spoilers, though. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, don't worry. We'll be dancing around some of those endings graciously. So social media was a huge piece of this, but this is the culmination of a decade plus of Marvel films. Now, you've directed 4 Marvel films. First one was Captain America Winter Soldier. Second one, Captain America Civil War, which is really considered Avengers 2.5, where you first sort of pulled back in Iron Man, started sort of gathering the troops here to lead up to the last 2 Avengers films. How did you think of this as an ensemble piece, but also building on what other directors had done? It's not like you were continuing a franchise that you had done entirely yourselves. You're picking up the work of other people.
Yeah, I think we were very fortunate in that our first movie was Captain America Winter Soldier, and that was the second Captain America movie after his first film, which was the first Avenger. The first Avenger was set during World War II, and it was very much a love letter to like the golden age of the comic character. The very sort of straightforward, rousing, mission-driven version of that character. We were now in Winter Soldier, we were going to now place Cap in the present day. So he had gone and been frozen in the ice, and even though he had appeared in Avengers, it wasn't really an individual story. He was part of an ensemble. His sort of life in the modern day hadn't been explored yet. So Joe and I had this great opportunity to, even though we weren't entering at the beginning, we were entering at a moment of like massive change for the character. And that we knew that we had an opportunity because this character had been, everything in his life from the 40s had been ripped away from him. Nothing about his environment was the same any longer. We knew that we had an opportunity to really take a big swing and reboot the character in a way that we felt was more tonally modern and a version of the character that appealed to us more, frankly. So we had a lot of license in terms of where we can go and how we can kind of retone the character. And I think the lifeblood of the MCU is very much about that, how individual directors come in and put their own stamp on these characters, on the story. They have their own individual tones, their own individual themes that they're playing with. And I think that's really what keeps these movies fresh and exciting. And of course, all of this pattern this pattern was established over the past, many, many decades in the comic books themselves, where individual writers and artists would come in and reinvent and do different versions of characters. So I think that's just continuing now on the cinema level.
Joe, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about this idea of weaving together characters from other films and bringing in so many different pieces, and how you balance all these characters and make sure that the audience doesn't lose track. They're reminded what happened in past films and what that character's incentive is, and you keep it all flowing in a way it seems like a pretty remarkable juggle. I mean, what's the process? Is there a huge board with lots of post-it
Yeah, there is.
and
I mean,
cards?
it's a very disciplined and focused process where you have a writer's room with a lot of white walls in it, magnetic boards, cards that we, write down ideas on, put on the board, and really everything. Writing a screenplay is an exceedingly structured process. If you understand how a screenplay breaks down, you can hit targets as you go, and those are anchors that allow you to adhere to the structure and make it easy for people to follow. The tricky part is, of course, weaving in that many characters, and that just takes a lot of work and a lot of passes at the script, so that with each character, we would take a few days and talk through the character and then weave the character through the script. What does the character want? What are we trying to say thematically with the character? What is the resolution of this character? What's their motivation? Move on to the next character, do the same thing. So it's just a laborious and intense process.
And when you signed on to direct the last two movies, I think it's really interesting that you did them back to back. And so you must have storyboarded or worked out the whole last two, this whole culmination of this franchise all in one fell swoop. What did you think about the responsibility that you held to the Marvel Universe, and also what themes you wanted to highlight, especially in this last film?
Well, yeah, thematically, what was nice about working on Winter Soldier, Civil War, 4 films, is that we were able to infuse thematics that were important to us, and we learned from each movie. I mean, certainly to make a movie of this scale, you don't understand the global connectivity of content like this. And as we traveled to each market to promote the movie, we would get feedback from the market and understand, this is interesting, this is, not every market perceives the content the same way, but they're all motivated by the same thing, which is thematics. And, I think if you look at the 4 films that we've done, the thematics are about destiny. Are you predestined? Can you change your destiny? And at what cost? And it really defines, I think, heroism in the truest sense of the term, especially when you get to Avengers Endgame. I don't want to talk about any of the plot for people who haven't seen it, but complicated things happen in the movie. And I think those thematics resonate no matter who you are, what market you're in, or what part of the world you're from.
What was the experience going around the world, India, China? You visited more places in the to connect with fans about this film than any of your prior ones. But what have you learned along the way with each of these Marvel films in terms of what resonates with fans? And when you were listening to fans for this film, were you like, okay, we know that this really works in China and this really works in Russia. We should really steer things more this way. I mean, how much did you react to the thoughts of fans?
I mean, we make these movies for the fans. We consider ourselves fans ourselves. So the interaction with the audience is something that Joe and I have always fed off of. I mean, we started as micro-budgeted indie filmmakers where your big epic experience was taking the movie to the film festival and sort of finally getting to engage it with an audience about it. So that audience response is extremely important to us. That being said, we don't design the movie for different parts of the world in the manner you were describing. Because we sort of, Joe and I, at the end of the day, have to orientate our storytelling to our own perspective and our own point of view. And we have such a depth of respect for this material stretching back to our childhoods. We love these characters. We love all the work that the MCU has done on screen with these characters. So we're very tuned into what is valued collectively by people about these characters and these stories. And then we just really try to service our own instincts about where these stories should go and how we should test the characters and how we should surprise ourselves. There's a big bug here.
That was the Wasp,
yeah.
one of your characters.
Right, checking it out.
She didn't get enough lines in the movie.
Yeah. but going around the world, I think, I mean, look, there was two big revelations, I think, from taking these movies, starting back with Winter Soldier, taking them around the world, and that, number one, discovering that there is this global fandom for these movies and these characters that transcends all the particulars of culture and nationality, which is kind of shocking to see that there can be a piece of fiction that can unite so many people in similar ways. And that's a really empowering idea, an exciting idea, and I think a hopeful idea for the future of the Earth in many ways, in the sense that we can find these connections. And the other thing I think the big takeaway from taking the movies around the world is that we take so much for granted in the United States and other countries like the United States in terms of personal freedoms. And there are many countries in the world where these movies play that don't enjoy the same level of personal freedoms. And so there are ideas in these movies that, while they are interesting and important to an audience in this country, are sort of vitally important to people in other countries and inspiring. And sometimes the first indication that people in some places have that there is any hope in terms of finding certain sort of civil liberties and et cetera. So anyway, it's kind of it's a really intense global phenomenon, the communication about these films.
And was there anything in particular that surprised you going around the world and talking to fans?
I mean, in this one in particular, you could feel the momentum when we were doing publicity. I mean, it was intense. We had visited India for the first time as a market, and it was, there's a recognition factor that goes with the amount of people that show up at fan events, or how often, honestly, you just may get recognized walking through an airport. You can tell there's you can gauge a saturation level, and it was intense this time. And I thought, oh, interesting. I hope this is translating in all markets this way.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because traditionally people think of the Indian movie business as being very different, very distinct. What resonates there is different. Same thing with China, as it being a slightly different audience in terms of what the demands are, but this really has had a global appeal. You mentioned social media, Joe, and I know you have at Russo Brothers. You tweet, you have 1.7 million followers on Instagram last time I checked, though that number has probably gone up. How do you think of social media as a tool to connect and also to hear what people are saying?
Well, it certainly is a way to connect, and we like being abstract with our social media. I think it is part of generating conversation. I think there's a very clear ratio between social conversations and success with these movies. And I think that the serialized storytelling of the Marvel Universe is really the key to the box office numbers behind this movie. But so we like to tease the fans, withhold information, put clues out there that are very inscrutable, that they can expend energy trying to crack. And I think that creates engagement. And it creates engagement in a way where I think you have to be careful with social media about engaging too much. There's a line you can cross. We don't particularly tend to ever respond directly to fans, but we put information out there and let them have conversations about it. Now, we can receive information back. Certainly you can go to Twitter and see what's trending, or get a sense for what people are responding to or what conversations are happening. But again, you have to be careful because we're also in an environment where it's easy to create an incendiary conversation on social media that may ultimately not be all that substantial. Because ultimately, I do think that it is still a minority of people that are very actively vocal on social media. You're not getting a full spectrum of opinion. You're getting a specific opinion.
There's been some talk about how the rise of the Marvel franchise over the past decade plus has been mirrored or corresponding with the rise of social media and the reach of Facebook and Twitter, and now more recently Instagram, and the conversations that's enabled. And you mentioned it earlier, Tony, we were talking this idea of social media fueling the fear of missing out and how that drives a weekend like this one. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I just think that, again, if you're instigating a conversation, and right now it can be a global conversation because people from all over the world can talk to each other instantaneously via Instagram or Twitter, via comment section, and anything that drops. If we put a trailer online via social media, it will reach millions of people within an hour, all over the globe. So I think that this, that the drivers who do, I did say it was a minority, but I think they're drivers, that are active, that are vocally active, and I think that starts to generate this momentum. So even if you're on there casually and it starts filling up your feed, and people are saying, I have to see this, I have to see this, it starts to imbue in you a desire to see it. And I think with, something like Endgame, there had been a momentum that was built for 10 years by the success of all these movies. And just think about that for a second, because Kevin Feige had an idea 10 years ago to engage in a serialized story that weaved together 11 different franchises. He made 21 movies. If he missed on one of them, we're probably not here. It's a staggering feat of producing. That is what's unprecedented. And I think I don't want to be remiss about that. Is that he had to hit on all 21 of those films, and he did. And if you go look at the Marvel cinema scores, they're insane. And that's what led us to here is a combination of a lot of elements.
So over the past decade plus, we've seen these 21 movies succeed, and we've seen the rise of social media. And on the flip side, we've also seen the rise of streaming, putting pressure on box office. We've seen fewer, bigger hits. Obviously, the Marvel movies have been huge. But viewing habits have changed so dramatically in the past decade. How did you think about making a movie differently because streaming is now such a force and the bar to get people to leave their Netflix and go out and buy movie tickets is so much higher?
Well, there was one other point I was going to add to your previous question, but it kind of touches on this as well, which is also during the past 10 years, you've seen a movement toward movies being released, what they call day and date, around the world at the same time, which is, used to be not as common, but it's become increasingly more common. And because it's important, because again, like Joe was talking about, there's a dialogue that's happening on a global scale via the internet about these movies. So, it's become important to studios to make sure that everybody can engage in that conversation together. Nobody feels left out of that conversation, and that nobody feels like, by the time they get the movie, they've heard everything and it's no longer fresh or exciting. So I think this focus on making an event, a global event that everyone is experiencing at the same time, which is a very difficult thing to do, as you can imagine. There's all kinds of idiosyncrasies in different markets around the world, whether they be national holidays or rhythms of school vacations, whatever the case may be, that kind of affect when the ideal dates are for release. So when you can actually figure out, like with Endgame, where you're literally releasing it everywhere at the same time, it's a pretty difficult thing to pull off, but it's critical because of that collective experience that everybody's having.
And so I want to talk more about some of the global trends, but you mentioned day and date. I mean, this is a movie. Disney is probably the only studio that has zero interest in going day and date with its releases because it doesn't need to. It can get people to go to the movie theater for weeks, for months. They sell DVDs, they sell video on demand. Other studios are more interested in that day and date release. What do you think would have happened if this movie had been released for video on demand and also in theaters at the same time?
Oh, it's interesting question. I mean, I don't know. That's hard to say because it's never been done at this scale. I think I don't know. It's interesting to think about, but
here's the thing. There's something that's very unique that happens in these movie theaters. I mean, I don't know if anybody was in a theater over, in one of the opening days of movie, but they're
Or opening nights at a 3 a.m. showing or a 4 a.m. showing, because there were plenty of those too.
Yeah, exactly. And it can feel a little bit like a rock concert, the
Yeah.
energy in there. The crowds are so vocal. And that's such a unique experience. That's something, obviously, you can't get at home. So I think that's something that pulls people out. That's a whole layer of excitement, and it's a whole dimension to the experience that can't be achieved at home. And that is unique to these films, and clearly the audience is enjoying.
And I think you asked this question a minute ago, but the correlation between film and OTT platforms, I think they're supercharging each other. And I think that the experience that you want in a theater is what you can't get in your home, which is I can go collectively and cheer, feel something, laugh. Here, you get validation through the way that you experience the movie because other people are experiencing it the same way that you are, and it's a collective acknowledgement. When characters will come on screen, people will burst into applause. I love that character, so I'm going to applaud. I'm part of this a group of people that admire this character, and I think that the sense of identity that you can create out of that. Certainly what you're getting at home is really high quality content, which is, was never the case wasn't always the case with television. It slowly started to change in around 2000 with the advent of HBO, The Sopranos, cinematic television. Now I think, there are shows on OTT platforms that I can watch that I think are better than 98% of the movies that have come out in a given year. That's how good the quality has become. But it's driving theatrical to be eventized. And I think that, Marvel is the prime example of the kinds of stories and boxes you have to check in order to garner this level of fandom and this level of box office.
And it's worth noting, of course, that you both started off in television. We saw some clips from Community, from Arrested Development. How is that process different, and what did you bring from the TV experience that shaped how you approach these films?
Yeah. Well, we didn't actually start off in television. We started off as sort of just kind of mid-late 90s sort of indie filmmakers. Then we did segue. That was around the time, like Joe mentioned, with The Sopranos changing TV, there was all of a sudden a migration from, I think, indie cinema to TV because television wanted to start being more ambitious on a cinematic level. So a lot of the TV executives started to look to independent filmmakers to bring into because they couldn't afford sort of the top level feature filmmakers. So they started looking to indie filmmakers to kind of bring into television, and that began about a 10-year run for Joe and I, where we made a lot of TV shows, what you said, what did we learn there that helped us? I mean, pretty much, first of all, shooting Infinity War and Endgame back to back was about as ambitious and difficult an undertaking as you can imagine in the film business. And I think television prepares you very well for that because TV is hard. You're prepping, you're shooting, and you're editing all at the same time when you're making a TV show because you've got episodes that are coming down the road, episodes you're executing, episodes you're finishing. So it's a very much an around-the-clock process where you're doing every phase of the filmmaking process on top of one another, which is very difficult. On these two movies, shooting them back to back, we were forced to work in a very similar way where we were doing all of those things concurrently, which is tough. So I think we had the training from TV to do that, especially over a decade of TV. Also, of course, we learned to work with big ensembles in television. A lot of TV is ensemble work, especially the stuff that we've been drawn to is large ensemble work. So dealing with a large number of characters, tracking storylines over multiple years. Again, that speaks directly to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, understanding how we sort of carry Easter eggs forward and pull threads for the people who are really paying attention to the storytelling. All those things are really television techniques that we developed that we use in the MCU.
So much of your success must really depend on your partnership and your ability to be complementary to each other. Rewind to the moment when you started collaborating. I mean, you're brothers. I have two sons. I can't imagine what your parents must have done to raise you to be able to work so well together. But how did the collaboration start? And what has enabled you to be able to succeed as brothers and clearly as friends as well as collaborators?
Well, it started, I think, I was 20 and Anth was 21. We both grew up loving movies. We were cinephiles. We were surrounded by movies. Our father loved watching the late shows, so we get a strong dose of the Bowery Boys and Humphrey Bogart movies. We grew up very close to a cinematheque, so we watched a lot of art house film and foreign film. And we both equally loved films and discussing them. A tradition at our house was to watch The Godfather on Christmas. It was a filmmaking household. So, but we never picked up a camera and made a movie as kids the way that Spielberg did. We really just talked about movies. We talked about thematics, metaphors, why we were moved, what it was that we loved about the story and the characters. And then Anth was, our father was a lawyer. Anth was in law school at the time, and I was getting an MFA in acting. We were both at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. And Robert Rodriguez had made a movie called El Mariachi. And he wrote a book about how he made the film for $7,000, which didn't take into account, I think, a lot of money that Miramax had dumped in the movie after they bought it. But, under the belief that we could make a film for $7,000, we said, let's go get some credit cards. We'll max them out. If the movie doesn't work, we'll just, declare bankruptcy. We're young, and so we did that foolishly. We lived in Cleveland, and we're a million miles away from the film business. And we spent 2 or 3 years working on that film and got discovered by a filmmaker named Steven Soderbergh at the Slamdance Film Festival. So our relationship was just, it's always been formed over being family. Our parents are very big on family first. And I think because we're brothers, it makes it easy for us to challenge the material in a way that other filmmakers can't with collaborators, because no matter how hard we go at the material or at each other, everything's gone within 5 minutes, and hopefully the idea is better for it, and we move on. So I think that the part of our secret recipe is the fact that we're family.
And how do your skill sets complement each other? I mean, one thing that's so striking watching Endgame, but also all of your films, is this balance of humor and heart and these teary moments with these hilarious things you that almost sort of, bring you into another world. Does one of you handle more of the comedic elements than the other? Or how do you deal with that balance?
I imagine every directing team functions differently. It has a different chemistry. Ours is, we kind of like to do everything together. That's our process. Mm-hmm. We sort of like to both be present. We like to both have our brains on everything together. We sort of have this like nonstop Socratic dialogue between ourselves about how we're going to saw our way through things, ideas and whatnot. So I don't know, we don't differentiate a lot in terms of what our duties or areas of focus are.
We subscribe to the mastermind principle, which is the notion that two minds are not doubly better than one; they're exponentially better. So there's a greater whole than there is in parts with us, and I think that we recognize that fact, which is why that we try to focus collectively on everything we do.
Another thing that you both must be very good at is managing people. We talked about the ensemble, the fact that there are literally dozens of characters of big stars that you have to bring together for these films. And we were talking a little bit backstage about this idea that when you were doing Captain America: Civil War, you sort of made that an early Avenger, another Avengers film by getting Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr., to play a big role, but not being the star, which was kind of an unusual move for him. So how do you think about managing people? Here we are, Milken, talking so much about business, and I think you, despite your early credit card debt, must be really good at thinking about management.
Yeah, look, we certainly, I think, are well prepped for it because we grew up in a sort of a really big, extended Italian-American family that had a lot of strong personalities, and so I think we're used to like a very kind of large and combustible sort of group dynamic. But I think the way I think really what unifies people is the work. At the end of the day, I think Joe and I always stay very focused on what we're trying to achieve and being able to present what we want to achieve in a very clear way, a very exciting way, being able to defend what we're trying to achieve, sort of building the right kind of coalitions, among people in the process to support what we're trying to achieve. It's a very focused agenda that we have, and maybe we sort of, we just pursue that in a way that sort of, and of course, by our nature, Joe and I are collaborative, right? We're a team, so we value the process of collaboration. It's not like we're just trying to ram our point of view through the process. We love having these very talented creative collaborators contribute to the vision of what the movie's going to be, for sure. But I think it's people will often look to the director or to us as the anchor for what we're all trying to collectively do together. And it's sort of our job to advance that and set everybody's relationship to that.
You brought up Downey. I think he is a critical piece of the success here. If I were to go down the checklist, he's certainly at the top or very near the top in terms of the success over the last 10 years. He's a maverick. He takes chances. He's an artist. We went to him on Civil War and said, listen, we have this idea for this cohesive arc, but it involves you taking a detour as a villain and playing the antagonist in this movie. And here's where we think it goes, and here's how we think it's a redemptive arc, and here's how, over the course of 10 movies, we think it's going to make it more compelling for you as an actor to play. Mm-hmm. Because you can't keep, and part of what is tricky about serialized storytelling is you have to keep evolving it. You have to take chances. You have to make disruptive choices. You have to surprise the audience. Because, they can tell you they love chocolate ice cream, but I'll tell you, you give it to them 15 times in a row and they're going to start throwing it back at you. So, we really worked hard to convince him that this was the right move. And then it's what, created a rift between the characters, which allowed them to lose in Infinity War and then to try to repair that in Endgame. And I think that the audience went on a journey hoping that would happen. It created a groundswell of interest in the characters.
So here you are. You've done the impossible. You've had this amazing culmination to this arc of stories. What's next for you, and how will you approach movie making and producing TV and directing TV differently now that you've had this experience?
I'm going to go lay down on a couch over there and take a nap right after this. But, we're working on our own studio. It's called Agbo. We started about 2 years ago. We raised some financing. We're big into artist ownership, and we're big into teaching other artists about ownership and helping people the way that Soderbergh helped us. We feel like we owe a karmic debt to the universe, so we've got a lot of young filmmakers that we're working with who inspire us, that we're trying to help get through the system and tell interesting stories with. So that's a big part of our agenda. And then we're making a movie in the next few months with Tom Holland, who plays Spider-Man, based on a book called Cherry, which is loosely based on a true story, and it's about the opioid epidemic. A decorated paramedic comes back from the Iraq War, has PTSD, and ends up using heroin as a way to cope. And it's a very thoughtful and powerful story about what's going on in this country right now.
And your company has deep ties to China, and you have a presence there or connections?
We do. We have a partnership with the number one distributor in China, a company named YE Brothers. We're fortunate in that Captain America: Winter Soldier was really well received over there. We made a lot of friends traveling there to promote the movie, and it was at a time where Chinese companies were looking for a way to get into the international market. And we partnered up to start Agbo.
And then you also are making an Amazon series. So you certainly haven't left TV, but now TV is streaming. So what's your thought on working with the streamers now?
Well, it's really exciting because, again, the streamers provide us as storytellers a lot of what Marvel has provided us, which is a global audience. The streamers are as focused on the idea of a unified global audience as feature companies are. So that's, and I think you've seen that over the years now, like for instance with Game of Thrones and other shows, where you've got this sort of growing global fandom. And what that has enabled it to do is, like, the budgets that you're seeing in television are unprecedented. And there's a reason why these companies can keep spending more and more money making TV shows, is because there's more and more money to be made. Again, because of the growing global audience. I think that's the key to so much of the growth in what we do is in the global audience. You know, there's still areas of the world like Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, etc., that aren't anywhere near the threshold of movie theaters or home viewing platforms that the United States or Europe has. So there's a lot of growth out there to be had in the developing areas.
There's an interesting race going on, I think, for eyeballs, and in a way, you know, with Apple announcing this, you know, consortium of apps. It's basically, you know, it's digital cable TV.
It's a new bundle.
It's a new bundle. It's reinvented itself. I think there's room for a lot of platforms, but I think the biggest race and the closest race to watch is Disney versus Netflix. I think Netflix is at volume, and they have to get their volume to quality consistently. And Disney clearly is at quality, and they've got to get the volume. So it's going to be interesting to see who achieves their goals first, because I think that is going to determine dominance in the market, unless, of course, I think Apple throws their hat into the content game in a way that is much more significant than what they're doing right now, because certainly they have the deep pockets to do it. Mm-hmm. What's unique about the market right now is that we're talking about, you know, 10 years ago you were dealing with studios that had, you know, $5, $10, $15 billion valuation outside of Disney, maybe 20, 25. Now you're talking about trillion-dollar companies that are using narrative as a branding tool, and this is a decimal error for them to participate with a few $1 billion. So I think, you know, it just depends what their appetite is for that branding, and how much exposure they can gain off of it, because certainly the most deep-pocketed players have the highest advantage in this game.
And do you see the medium changing the message, the format changing the way the content looks and feels? Because I mean, your shows,
I think it's already changed it, yeah.
So, but like Arrested Development,
right.
You created those shows to be watched a week apart, and now people are binge watching them all, you know, over the, you know, maybe 4 hours at a time. Are you creating the content differently if you expect it to be binge as opposed to meted out?
Oh, without question.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
we've always loved. I mean, look, there's nothing better for an artist, at least the kind of artist that we are, than to sort of be able to change the format, because it allows us to use different muscles, go in different directions, approach audiences in a different way. I mean, clearly, Endgame is the perfect example. Like, no one has ever seen anything like Endgame before on a storytelling level, and you see what that's done to audiences. It's led to a very unique experience in movie theaters for people. So yeah, we love the fact that we're in a time of disruption and change, and it is definitely something that allows us to construct narratives differently, and sort of surprise audiences differently.
And I don't think, I mean, it's, you know, people have been talking about the death knell for theatrical because of streaming, but I think this movie's proof that they're supercharging each other in a way that we couldn't predict. And I think that just there's an addiction to content consumption, and people fill a lot of hours every week with narrative, and it's how can they get it, and what kind of experience can they have watching it. You get one kind of experience in your house and one kind of experience at the theater, but I do think the theater moving forward, its highest success rate will be through eventized storytelling, serialized storytelling. I think I made a comment like 6 months ago where I said, I think that the 2-hour closed-ended film had a really significant run for 100 years, but that you know, with the advent of streaming and with the advent of the Marvel Universe, I think this generation is craving a different kind of storytelling, and that is long form, long-term emotional investment, conversation pieces. It's just as I was saying earlier, social media is driving a different kind of consumption, and it's only going to continue to move in that trajectory.
And so what does that mean for the kinds of indie films that you started off making? Do those not need a theatrical release anymore because you could buy them on
I think
iTunes?
you can get a lot more money to make them on a streaming service and at a higher quality. So I think there's a real advantage there. It's very difficult to make movies like Roma theatrically. And I think, Netflix supporting interesting content, Scorsese, I think he's working with an insane budget on his new movie, 100 plus. Again, I think that's a very difficult movie to get made theatrically, but Netflix is supporting it. So there's advantages all over the place. You just have to know how to find those advantages. And as viewers, I think we all benefit because we have a volume of really, really great content at our disposal.
But we'll see. There may be, we're sort of in a time where things are flowing in a certain direction, but, audiences may want smaller films in movie theaters. They may want to get out of the house. They may want a communal experience on smaller films. We don't know. This is something that is all TBD and to be worked out.
Early days.
Covered, yeah.
And a lot of talk about how the success of your film will drive subscribers to Disney Plus, which is launching in November. Those characters from your films will be featured in those shows. Would you ever consider working on any of those Disney Plus originals?
Yeah, we love all the actors.
Yeah, we love those characters.
It's again, we're storytellers. Anywhere that we can tell a great story, and I think we've shown over our careers, whether it's film, television, big movies, little movies, comedy, drama, we're just engaged by the idea of telling stories, and wherever we can find that challenging story, we're happy to tell it. We're not prejudiced.
Format agnostic.
Yeah. We're not prejudiced towards any mediums. In fact, they each have their own strengths. And if you know what those strengths are, then you can enjoy that as a storyteller.
Well, I want to open up for a few audience questions, if we have any. I see some hands. I know where the microphone is. Do we have a microphone, or should we just ask questions?
There it is, I think.
Here we go. Is there one right here?
Could you tell us a little bit more about the early years? You're from Cleveland, Ohio, Case Western Reserve University, not known for producing successful filmmakers, and you mentioned the credit card debt. Tell us about the first film, the second film, if I know correctly, Collinwood, not very financially successful. Tell us about the challenges in the very early years.
Sure, yeah.
They were innumerable.
Yeah, they were epic years. Like Joe was describing earlier, we basically, started chasing this idea of Robert Rodriguez's $7,000 movie, and it took us a few years to make it. I think we finally ended up getting the movie in the can for like $35,000. We basically sought everybody out in Cleveland that we could find that knew anything about filmmaking. We read every book we could find about filmmaking, about actually the hands-on how-to. We rented. We put the movie together with a bunch of family and friends. And then I guess what happened was we shot the film and we were like, okay, well, now we've shot a movie. We figured out how to actually shoot a movie. But now what do we do with it? We're in Cleveland. We don't have any connection to the wider film world whatsoever. So we thought, well, we could do two things. We can either move to New York or LA and get jobs in the film business and see if we can start finding connections there, or we can go to film school. And that'll help us because we're running out of money, so we can get some student loans. We can lean on they have editing equipment, so we can help finish the movie with the editing equipment. And we decided on the latter. We used some of the footage that we had shot to apply to film school. And at the time, this was like in the mid-late 90s where, the indie scene in New York was really hot. So we didn't know what coast we belonged on. So we split up for film school, and I went to Columbia, New York. Joe went to UCLA. And we spent about a year and a half in film school, and during which time we finished up that movie that we had shot. And then that movie started to make the festival circuit. And that's when, like Joe mentioned earlier, Steven Soderbergh just happened to see our movie at the Slamdance Film Festival. Somebody had recommended it to him. He had a movie that year that was opening the festival called Schizopolis, which is one of his smaller, weirder movies. And it was it was weird in a very similar way that our movie was. So I think we were just kind of in the same sort of creative space on those films. He responded strongly to ours, gave us a call like a week later and said, hey, we should get together, I liked your movie. Started speaking with them, and he basically offered to produce our next movie for us, which eventually led to a movie called Welcome to Collinwood. It's a movie we also shot in Cleveland, although on a much larger budget, but still a small film. It was an ensemble comedy. And then while we were editing that movie, this is sort of when the television transition happened. We were in the edit room finishing that movie up, and Kevin Riley, who was running FX at the time, was looking to hire a director for a really strange show they were producing called Lucky. It was a really sort of dark comedy. And again, HBO had just changed television with The Sopranos, so FX wanted to become the free cable HBO. That was their goal. So they were looking for shows that could sort of give them that identity. And this comedy, I think The Shield had just premiered on FX, and now they wanted to do basically a comedy in a similarly sort of indie vein. And so they hired us to direct this comedy, which was a very dark comedy. John Corbett was the lead. It was basically he was a gambling addict. His wife had died through their sort of joint addictions, and the whole pilot was about him falling off the wagon to gamble again so he could earn enough money to pay his wife's parents back for the cost of her funeral. So it's a very funny show, right? But so we directed this movie this pilot, and even though the show didn't end up working for FX, ultimately they made a few episodes, but that was it. But that pilot became like an industry favorite. Everybody loved that pilot around the business. So all of a sudden we were getting all these calls. Everybody wanted to meet with us. And one of the people that wanted to meet with us was Ron Howard and David Nevins over at Imagine, and they were prepping a show called Arrested Development, and they hadn't they needed a director for, and that pilot of Lucky basically got us hired to direct Arrested Development, which we ended up winning an Emmy for, and boom, then we were like comedy TV directors for 10 years, which was a great run for us, but not something, had you asked us at the beginning if we had ever imagined that becoming our career, we would have never imagined that. So it was, it's sort of a long elliptical road, but you can kind of trace the trail when you look at it.
There was another question right here. It's okay, you can project.
Okay. I actually had a question about the use of science in Endgame. I promise it's a spoiler-free question. Because obviously it's a big tentpole movie, it's in a comic book universe, so there's not necessarily an expectation that there would be really strong science, but there were a lot of really thoughtful details and a lot of times where you had kind of very scientific dialogues between people where somebody would say, oh, well, this is what I expect, and another person would say, well, but the reality is very different than that. So I was just curious because clearly somebody thought to put that level of detail into the movie. Who was behind it? Kind of how did you get the science advisors to contribute, and how did you weave that particular thread into the overall arc of your story?
We'll typically have advisors come in. We had a bunch of physicists on this one come in and talk to us in the room about some of the theories in the movie and what they believed. And then, of course, your job as a storyteller, and we have amazing collaborators in Chris Marcus and Steve McFeely, who've written all of the movies that we've done for Marvel, plus I think 3 more Marvel films. They've done a total of 7, I believe. And really understand these movies, but you have to make choices as a filmmaker as to what, because clearly some of the things that we're dealing with in the film, again, without spoiling anything, are highly theoretical. So you make choices about what works for your storytelling based on, all the theoretical ideas that are out there. And then try to apply a consistent logic throughout. And that gets tested by myself and my brother and the writers. The 4 of us sit in a room and, push and pull against each other regarding the science of it. And, of course, there ain't technical language in the movie. It's either researched by the writers or someone at Marvel for them, or an advisor has given us some technical language once we describe what it is that we need the character to say.
Yeah, I think that was important to us because for 2 reasons. Number one, exploring the most current scientific ideas, I think it was a road for us to try to find, a more original creative expression in terms of what can happen in the movie. Also, we love movies that are very layered. Now, we like to create movies that are like very dense experiences so that you can sort of revisit them over and over and still have new things to discover on multiple viewings, because those are all of our favorite movies are like that. So I think the other thing is that, when we're running at science like that, we're looking to really build in a layer of ideas and intellect into the film that you can chew on.
I think we have time for one more question.
Not so much a question, just a thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for making such an outstanding film. I mean, every aspect of it was just tremendous. The writing, the directing, the acting, and your love for these characters and movies in general comes through very clearly. And thank you for doing justice to the characters and the actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We really appreciate that.
So then I'm going to I second that.
Thank you all.
I'm going to have our very last note be about your focus on embracing diversity in these films, especially in this last one, which could not have had a more diverse cast of characters. How do you think about the importance of that and the message that sends to your fans around the world?
Well, I think it's critical. I think everyone has the right to see themselves on screen and identify with the character on screen. I think the thing we're most proud of the Marvel Universe moving forward is that it's exceedingly diverse and only growing in that regard. And I think there's going to be a lot of really fantastic, empowering, and emotional choices that are going to be made with casting over the next 2 to 3 years.
Great. Well, I think we are out of time. But Joe and Anthony, thank you both so much for joining us after your world tour. Thank you.
You all.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the